heartbreak in Israel after the two young Bibas brothers, who became the greatest symbol of the October 7th hostage crisis, were returned home in oversized coffins. Many more hostages remain in Gaza, some dead, others still alive. Their condition unknown as fears of another war breaking out emerge. For some Middle East analysts, Iran is to blame for setting off the flames for October 7th and the ensuing conflict. But what are the root causes, and how does Iran play into today's conflict? Today, we're joined by author of Ghosts of a Holy War, an award-winning foreign correspondent, Yardena Schwartz.
The Palestinians have become pawns in the rest of the Arab world, kind of jockeying for power. I think that has made it all the more difficult to solve this conflict, because perpetuating it and continuing this conflict is in the best interest of, sadly, in the best interest of people like the leaders of the IRGC.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Yardena Schwartz joins us now in studio. Welcome to Eye for Iran.
Thanks so much, Negar. It's so great to be here.
It's a pleasure having you here. Before we begin with the Iran angle, let's talk about you and get to know you and your journey a little bit better. How did you go from being a journalist in Israel for 10 years? You worked for various publications, from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to Rolling Stones to National Geographic to MSNBC and NBC News, to writing this book, Ghosts of a Holy War, which looks into the 1929 massacre in Hebron. How did that all come about?
So it all began in 2019 when I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee, that had discovered a box of letters in their attic. And those hundreds of pages of letters were written by their late uncle, David Shainberg, who they had never met because he was murdered in this massacre in 1929 in what was then British Mandate Palestine. And when I got to read those letters for the first time, I was just shocked that this period of history, which had been so crucial to the Zionist movement, to the conflict itself, and what I realized later on was really ground zero of this conflict as we know it, was so unknown. Maybe not in Israel,
I had
but
never
outside
heard
of
of
Israel.
it. I have to say, I had never heard of this at all, and I considered myself somebody to be, aware of history and historical events, and it was just such a deeply personal novel and such horrific accounts.
Yeah, I mean, I had known about the massacre, but very little, and I was really taken aback by how similar the causes of the massacre were, a century ago, to the various conflagrations we see today between Israelis and Palestinians. And I realized over the course of my research, which went far beyond just these letters, of course, into archival research and stories of other survivors and testimonies of, British officials at the time and Jewish officials and Arab officials. And it became really clear to me that you really cannot understand how we got to where we are in this conflict, and also how we can find a way out of it, without understanding what happened in 1929, why it happened, and what happened after. Because those ripple effects continue today. And we saw that in the most painful of ways on October 7th, 2023. One example of that is that the massacre of 1929 was the result of a campaign of disinformation and incitement perpetrated by the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, Hajj Amina Husseini. And that disinformation campaign centered around Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And, listeners might recall that October 7th, the attack was named by Hamas as the Al-Aqsa Flood. So this disinformation and this weaponization of Al-Aqsa that began in 1929 continues to this day, to the detriment of everyone involved, mostly the Palestinian people.
Let's talk more about those parallels. I mean, the similarities are, it's eerie.
Yeah, there are really just haunting echoes of what happened in 1929 on October 7th. The atrocities themselves were Almost exactly the same. I mean, in 1929, the massacre in Hebron was carried out by 3,000 Muslim men who marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron, which, by the way, is the burial place of Abraham. It's the second holiest city in Judaism. It was, at the time, one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities. The massacre ended up decimating that
And people were
community, but
getting along
yeah.
from what I was saying. Like there was a lot of love between the different communities, and even the Palestinian Muslims at the time were turning off their lights, some of them on Sabbath, out of respect for their Jewish neighbors.
Yeah, in David's letters that I was granted permission to use for this book, he writes really vividly and really beautifully about the remarkable relations between the city's Jewish minority and its Arab majority. And he wrote of weddings and Jewish holidays and celebrations where rabbis and Muslim leaders and sheikhs danced side by side into the night. And he wrote about this Jewish clinic, the Hadassah Clinic in Hebron, which was providing free medical treatment and care to the city's needy Arabs and Jews alike. And what happened in 1929, on August 24th, 1929, was that the Jewish community was just shocked to see that their neighbors who had once been their friends turned on them overnight, essentially. And on that's Shabbat, Sabbath morning, just like on October 7th, 2023, um, Muslims armed with swords, axes, and daggers marched through the Jewish quarter and broke into Jewish homes, set fire to the homes, burnt people alive. Infants were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Children watched as their parents were butchered by their neighbors. Um, Women and teenage girls were raped. Rabbis and yeshiva students were mutilated. Synagogues looted and destroyed. I mean, it was just an utter massacre. And what really made it such a devastating attack wasn't just the fact that it was so gruesome and so barbaric, but that, like you said, before that day, the Jewish community and the Muslim majority had coexisted side by side in peace, to the point where one day before these riots erupted, the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the IDF, they came to Hebron and warned the Jewish leaders of Hebron that there were going to be riots and that they were going to reach Hebron. And they offered to either evacuate the Jewish community to Jerusalem until the riots subsided, or to stay there and protect the Jewish community. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition. They said, absolutely not. Our Arab neighbors are our friends. They will never hurt us. If anything happens, they'll protect us. And they said that, the presence of Haganah men will only serve as a provocation. It'll only make them put them in more danger. And so they left, and the Jewish community of Hebron was completely defenseless. 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered that morning, and dozens others were wounded. And the British forces that ruled Palestine at the time evacuated the Jewish community and told them never to return, because it was clear that the British forces were both unable and, in a sense, unwilling to protect their Jewish subjects. So it really just transformed Hebron and also Zionism, and we can speak about that later.
Of course, yeah. And in a lot of David's letters and his testimonies reminded me of some of the interviews that I personally had with survivors of October 7th and the various kibbutzim, in terms of their they just couldn't believe that something like this would happen, and things were seemingly okay until a day before October 7th. They were completely shocked.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the main parallels. There are many others, but one of the parallels is the fact that in 1929, the people who were killed that day were not Zionists building the foundations of a Jewish state on their backs. They were pious Jews, religious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. They had lived side by side with their Arab neighbors for generations. Many of them spoke Arabic. Many of them were themselves, Sephardi, Mizrahi Jews. And on October 7th, many of the Jews who were killed and kidnapped were left-wing Israelis. Many of them were peace activists.
Hmm.
And as we've seen over the course of the last 16 months, many in Israel have shifted rightward. And the same thing happened after 1929. Many of the traditional religious Jews in Palestine and many of the Arabic-speaking Jews in Palestine really disdained the Zionist movement because they saw it as a secular
Even
European
David
movement.
himself, the main character in your novel, was against Zionism as it is today, I mean.
They were against the political movement of
Yes.
Zionism. They were Zionists as we see Zionism today as, the belief in the Jewish right to live in their homeland. They believed in that, but they were against this political movement
Mhm.
for a state because they saw it as, this secular movement because many of the founders of Zionism, not all, but many of
We're
them were
secular, yeah.
secular. And these people were very traditional and they saw it as this secular contamination of Judaism. And almost all of that opposition within the Jewish community of Palestine against Zionism evaporated after 1929 because they realized that if we are going to live in our homeland in peace or, at least with safety, then we need to live in our own country under the protection of our own army because clearly no foreign power was going to protect them. The British had absolutely failed in their responsibility to protect their Jewish subjects who, under their mandate to rule Palestine, were supposed to be creating this Jewish home, not a Jewish state, but a Jewish home where Jews could could feel safe and practice their religion freely and not have to live in fear of the pogroms that were raging in Eastern Europe, leading so many of them to come to Palestine. So it really transformed the Zionist movement and also served as the bedrock of the conflict as we know it because it set in motion so many of the forces that we see today that are fueling the conflict, such as the disinformation campaign and the incitement, much of which is centered around Al-Aqsa. But other parallels we saw to October 7th wasn't just, this disinformation and the weaponization of Al-Aqsa, but also what happened after the massacre. So what happened immediately after August 24th, 1929, just like what happened immediately after October 7th, was this simultaneous effort to both deny the atrocities had taken place and blame those atrocities on their Jewish victims. So the Arab leadership in Palestine at the time not only denied that atrocities had taken place in Hebron, but then at the same time said anyone who was killed and any massacre that took place was actually perpetrated by the Jewish yeshiva students in Hebron. David was one of those yeshiva students, and he was murdered along with 25 other yeshiva students. And yet the Arab leadership, including the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, whose incitement had led to this massacre, they claimed that these yeshiva students had carried it out in order to raise funds from the Jewish diaspora for their yeshiva. And that wasn't the only victim blaming that was going on. The British actually sent a commission from London to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots. And in 1930, so almost a year after the massacre, they concluded that the Mufti was not to blame. Of course, they had appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini
themselves,
to
yeah.
his role as Mufti, which made him the most powerful Muslim leader in Palestine. They pardoned him, despite the fact that if you read the testimony of this, 500-page report, it's very clear that his incitement played the leading role in inciting the riots. They blamed Jewish immigration for inciting legitimate fears among the Arab population. And they blamed this peaceful demonstration by Jews at the Western Wall that had occurred about 2 weeks before the massacre. This demonstration was peaceful, and it was directed at the British, and it was in protest of their failure to protect Jewish worshippers from praying at the holiest place they were permitted to pray, which is the Western Wall. And they were protesting that failure to protect them because the Mufti's disinformation campaign had led to increasingly frequent attacks by Muslims against Jewish worshippers, the Western Wall, because these Muslims were being told by their leaders that the Jews praying at the Western Wall were really seeking to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple.
The Temple Mount.
The Temple Mount, right. And the British, they could have done something to counter this disinformation campaign. They could have done something to rein in the Mufti and his incitement, and they didn't. So the Jews were protesting against the British, calling on them to allow them to pray freely at the Western Wall. And the Mufti and other Arab leaders and the Arabic press completely distorted what happened at that demonstration in Arabic newspaper reports and in leaflets that were published across Palestine. This demonstration was painted as one that involved violence against Muslim men, the rape of Muslim women, the curse. They claimed that Jewish protesters had cursed the Prophet Muhammad, and so from there, everything just spiraled out of control. There were counter protests by Muslim worshippers in Jerusalem that involved actual attacks against Jews. And, between that march, which occurred in mid August, to the riots, which took place across an entire week in the end of August, 133 Jews were killed in those riots, and more than half of them were killed in Hebron, which was this beacon of coexistence in Palestine. And, the reality we see today in Hebron today, which is the antithesis of coexistence, you really can't explain how Hebron went from being the beacon of coexistence to being its antithesis without understanding how that happened. And this is kind of the beginning of how that transformation occurred.
And so if you look at today, a lot of the kibbutzim in southern Israel as well, you have somebody like Oded Lifshitz from Kibbutz Nir Oz, who was driving down to Gaza and taking patients to the hospital. And, I met another person who started, kites for Gaza and a lot of things to try and build a peaceful coexistence. And a lot of these people ended up being the victims and killed or still being held hostage in Gaza as we speak.
Right. So I think that explains why we see this transformation in Israeli society today, in which, what was left of the Israeli peace camp, what was left of, left-wing Israel is really in tatters today, because so many of the people who were kidnapped or killed on October 7th were people who had spent years of their lives dedicated to advocating for Palestinian rights, to trying to bridge the divide between Israelis and Palestinians. And their lives were just shattered, if not taken violently on October 7th. And I think that trauma was really kind of solidified last week with the twisted ceremony we saw in Gaza, in which those 4 coffins containing the body of Oded Lifshitz, what was supposed to be the body of Shiri Bibas, and of course the bodies of Ariel and Kfir Bibas, who were about 8 months and 4 years old when they were violently abducted. And, seeing those celebrations of Palestinian men, women, and children at the site of those coffins really sent home the message to a lot of Israelis that, whatever hopes they had for a two-state solution or for peace and coexistence, for many Israelis, those hopes have been just devastated by not just what happened on October 7th, but by the reminders of what happened on October 7th last week with that ceremony.
And what did that do for you on a personal level?
It was really painful. Because even after October 7th, I still had hope that we could coexist and that, one day there could be a two-state solution, because I do think, to this day, I do think that that is the only way we will see peace and an end to this never-ending war, when both people have self-determination. But I think that the hope I had that could be achieved in my lifetime, or maybe even my own children's lifetime, I don't know, after what we saw last week in Gaza, I don't know if that is a realistic hope. I want it to be. I want to hold on to that hope, because without it, it's basically accepting that we're going to live in perpetual war without that hope. But I think that the only way we will be able to see that peaceful outcome is an entire re-education, de-radicalization program, not only in Gaza, but, in the West Bank as well, because Hamas enjoys vast amounts of support, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. And of course, in other parts of the Arab world. So I think that, you know, um, as devastating as those images were last week, it really confirmed what I came to believe over the course of writing my book, which is that, the disinformation that has fueled this conflict for the last century has to end. And I think that anyone working towards peace needs to recognize the devastating power of disinformation in fueling this conflict and the weaponization of Islam. I think both of those need to be key parts of any kind of peace effort. Even if not just peace effort within, between Israelis and Palestinians, but also like normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is supposed to include, some kind of step towards a Palestinian state. I think that will need to be part of that, a de-radicalization, re-education program. And so, that was really hammered out, that message of, the need for re-education and de-radicalization. That was 100% confirmed by the images we saw last week.
And let's talk about the radicalization, the politicalization of Islam. What does that and just in general extremism mean to you in terms of what you've learned in writing this novel? And again, all of the testimonies that you've read and all of the people that you've interviewed. Not only that, but being a journalist in the region for a decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that there is extremism on both sides. There are extremists on the Jewish side as well. There are Jewish extremists in the West Bank who are attacking Palestinians in the West Bank, and there's no excuse for that. And on the Palestinian side, the extremism, unfortunately, is very widespread and has a lot of support. So I think in Israeli society, when we see these attacks, there is kind of a sense of disgust or like disapproval. And often, maybe not enough, but often there are repercussions for people who do these things. And unfortunately, in Palestinian society, this kind of extremism is taught in their textbooks. I mean, I've done investigations of the UNRWA curriculum and the Palestinian curriculum. Part of that features in my book as well because it's all related. Um, and this curriculum can only be described as child abuse. I mean, children are literally being taught to aspire to become martyrs. They're being taught that the heroes of their cause are terrorists. There was this one group of school children I spoke to, and I was asking them what they had learned that day, and they showed me in their textbook a photo of a female terrorist who carried out an attack against civilian school children on a bus in the 1970s, and her picture was in their textbooks with captions calling her, a hero of the Palestinian people, and somebody to aspire to. And, that is what extremism looks like, and it is being taught to children. That's not the only thing, extremism looks like. It's also, the jihad that is being waged, not just by, Palestinian leaders, but also by the ayatollahs and, the supreme
Of Islam,
leader
Republic of Iran,
is,
yes.
yeah. And I think that it's, it can't really be discussed as this, just Palestinian problem. It's a regional problem. And, Hezbollah was another example of that jihad, the party of Allah, the Hamas, people often forget that the name of Hamas means the Islamic resistance movement. And, this weaponization of Islam is only hurting the Palestinian people and making the prospects for peace ever more distant. And it's really important to remember that, all of the efforts toward a two-state solution have been rejected by every single Palestinian leader. And it's time to ask ourselves why. What do they really want? And it doesn't really seem like anybody's asking them, what do they want? What outcome do they want? And I think the reason nobody's asking them is because we all know what the answer is. And, it's been obvious from the rejection of every peace effort, which is there is no settling for less than all of it. And the Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, he was very clear about that from the beginning when the first two-state solution was presented by the British in 1937. He not only rejected the two-state solution, he rejected the idea of even a one-state solution in which Jews and Arabs live together. Right, I mean, there's a reason why in the very beginning of this war, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, both Egypt and Jordan were adamant about not allowing Palestinian refugees into their countries. And, think about, has there ever been a modern war in which the people who are living in a war zone were forbidden from leaving by their supposed allies? Egypt sealed its borders on October 8th, or maybe it was October 10th. I don't remember exactly what day, but it was
Just
immediately
after,
after
yeah.
October 7th. They sealed their borders. And it's not that no Gazans made it into Gaza. 100,000 Gazans made it into Egypt. And yet each of them were forced to pay around $10,000 in bribes to Egyptian officials. So the hypocrisy here just can't be overstated.
And making money off of impoverished people, too, on top of that, right?
Exactly. And now saying that, the idea that allowing Palestinians into their countries would wreak havoc on their countries. Well, why do you think that is? Like, it's because of this radicalization that they have profited from, they have perpetuated, and they thought that they wouldn't have to pay the price for that. And sorry, but if you're going to radicalize an entire population into thinking that you're going to destroy Israel and, form an Islamist state there, like there's going to be consequences for raising generations of people who think this way.
Long-term consequences. Let's dig deeper into that and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So in terms of your definition of extremism, how does Iran play into all of this, especially given that it's a Shiite theocracy and you've got them rallying behind and supporting being allies with the Sunni-led Muslim group, Hamas?
So I think that alliance serves their goals. I think that, for the Islamic regime in Iran, the war with Israel takes precedence over its war with the Sunni world. And I think that, maybe that would come later if they accomplish their goal of destroying Israel, which, I hope they won't. I don't think they will. But, I think that Hamas, I think, sets their war with the Shia world aside for their common goal of, the destruction of Israel. And I think that, for both parties, it serves their goals of, distracting their own people from their failure to extricate themselves from poverty. So in Gaza, throughout the time that Gaza has been ruled by Hamas, Palestinians in Gaza have lived in poverty with high unemployment, and Hamas has not done anything to fix that. They've just kind of managed to stay in control by having this extremely suppressive regime, which continues to receive support from the Muslim world because it is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So the treatment of their own people doesn't matter, unfortunately. And
Same goes for Iran.
Exactly. The same goes for Iran. They are able to, get away with the horrific treatment of their own people and their neglect of their own people because they can please the extremist base, the Islamist base, with their perpetual war against Israel and their funding of their proxies in that war.
Well, yeah, and going back to the funding, a lot of analysts, Middle East analysts have said this is also robbing the people of Iran of their future because hundreds of millions of dollars is going to Hamas, is going to Hezbollah, that should be going to the people of Iran, but isn't.
In the same way, exactly. That's exactly true. And it mirrors the way that Hamas funneled all of the money it received from Qatar and from Iran and anywhere else it received money from. That money didn't go to improving the lives of the people of Gaza. The opposite, it went to building their vast tunnel network, to building up their rockets and their weapons and, turning Gaza into this terror state, which then required Israel, if it was going to prevent another October 7th, to go in and destroy that, this mass military base that they turned Gaza into. And that is why we see the total destruction of Gaza, because it wasn't as if there were, military bases and, isolated areas where Hamas was keeping these weapons or building these tunnels. They were built and stored everywhere in Gaza. I mean, there are soldiers who've testified that every other home they went into was either booby-tracked or contained rockets and weapons, and nearly every house had tunnels built underneath. And, you don't have to believe Israeli soldiers. I mean, Hamas doesn't hide this fact. It's not shy
No,
about
they
saying,
videotape it
like,
and they put it out there actually with
exactly.
very
Yeah.
high quality editing and cameras, I should point out too, right?
Right, and yet people still call this Israeli propaganda, even though Hamas is proudly showing this to the world. And so, the dissonance here, the cognitive dissonance here of what people claim to be Israeli propaganda versus what is actually Hamas's stated goals and, their stated actions that they video themselves is really just mind-boggling how people continue to just tell themselves what they want to tell themselves without just looking at reality.
Let's go back to the parallels of 1929 and October 7th. Can you set the scene for us, geopolitically speaking, 1929 versus October 7th and to the present day? Because, of course, now you have the role of Iran, too, that you
Mhm.
obviously didn't have in 1929.
Right. So in 1929, Israel didn't exist. It was 2 decades before the establishment of the State of Israel. Where Hebron was the British Mandate of Palestine. So the British had taken over the Ottoman province of Palestine after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire dissolved, and all of the vast territory that the Ottomans had ruled over were divided between France and the British. And so the British were ruling over what was British Mandate Palestine. You had Transjordan, you had Egypt, but it wasn't really yet this regional conflict that it is today. At the time, it was really just a conflict between the Jews and Arabs of Palestine. At the time, Palestinians weren't the Palestinians of today. Palestinians meant Jews living in Palestine, it meant Arabs living in Palestine. Jews who were born in Palestine were Palestinians.
Whoever had a
Jews
Palestinian
living
passport, yeah.
Right. So that's kind of setting the stage for what the landscape was in 1929 versus today. It is not just, I don't think it's appropriate to even call this the Israeli-Palestinian conflict anymore. That's why my book is called, it's about the Arab-Israeli conflict, because it's no longer just between these two people. I think if it was, this conflict would have been solved long ago. I think the fact that the Palestinians have become pawns in the rest of the Arab world's kind of jockeying for power, I think that has made it all the more difficult to solve this conflict, because perpetuating it and continuing this conflict is in the best interest of, sadly, in the best interest of people like the leaders of the IRGC. It's in the best interest of the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and this is why we see a rejection of this effort to resolve the conflict through giving Palestinian refugees citizenship in the countries where they were forced to flee to. I mean, as a reminder, Israel didn't force those people to flee. I mean, in certain cases, they were expelled in the fighting, but that war that led to what Palestinians call the Nakba, that war was launched by the Palestinian leaders within Palestine, the Arab leaders within Palestine in 1947, as a direct response to the UN vote to partition Palestine into an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state. Palestine could have gained independence for the first time in its history, by the way. It had never been independent. When people talk about free Palestine and going back to 1948, I'm always wondering, like, you mean you want to go back to 1948 when the British occupied Palestine, when Palestinians, Jews, and Arabs didn't have independence? It's so that was the state of the region in 1947, where it was still just this conflict between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine in 1947. And then once Israel declared independence, then the all surrounding states invaded, declared war. Nobody expected Israel to win that war, including the Jews living in Israel. And of course, the end of that war. By the end of that war, about 700,000 Arabs in Palestine had fled, became refugees in the very states that had declared war against Israel, places like Egypt, Jordan, Syria. And yet to this day, they have not been given citizenship or the rights that come with it. And that is one of another many hypocrisies of this conflict, that, the countries that claim to be working in the best interests of the Palestinian people are working against them, keeping them from working in certain jobs, keeping them from having, the same health benefits as their own citizens, and now, of course, refusing to allow them to seek refuge in their countries. I mean, imagine if Egypt hadn't sealed its border after October 7th, how many Palestinians would have been able to live out the war, away from the fighting? Israel could have just been fighting with Hamas. When I interviewed hostage families in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. I was doing reporting on the hostage crisis. And because again, these were, peace-seeking
Peace-loving
Israelis.
people,
These
yeah.
are left-wing Israelis. They were suffering knowing that their children or their husbands, their wives were being held hostages in Gaza. And they were thinking about the plight of the Palestinians. They were saying to me, I hope this was before Israel invaded Gaza. This was before October 26th when the ground invasion occurred. They were saying that they hope that the Palestinian civilians in Gaza are taken to somewhere safe, maybe in the Sinai in Egypt, so that Israel can just fight Hamas and not have to, involve the Palestinian civilians. So it was
It's
as
like
if
Hirsch's parents, the
Yeah.
American hostage that was murdered in captivity as well. Yeah, they were always constantly advocating and seeking peace for the other side of the conflict too.
It was as if they had more sympathy for the Palestinian civilians in Gaza than the Egyptians did or the Jordanians did, because Jordan also said no to allowing any Palestinians to take refuge in Jordan until the fighting was over.
And you mentioned the importance of education and de-radicalization in terms of over time coming towards a peaceful solution. But how do you do that when you factor in, like you said, all these other countries, that it's not just this, Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's the Arab-Israeli conflict, then there's also a country, Persian country like Iran as well, that's added into the mix, and that it's not in the interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran for there to be peace between the two neighbors. So how do you move towards this peaceful path when
Mm.
you've got all these other factors going on?
Well, I think it takes the international leaders that are working towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And I think that it's important to note that the educators here in these areas where Palestinian refugees are living, not only in Gaza and the West Bank and Jordan and Syria, but also Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, they're not being educated in those countries' educational systems. They're being educated in UNRWA schools. And, like I said earlier, UNRWA is their educational curriculum.
Which was being funded by
needs.
the U.S. up until recently.
And many European countries as
And
well.
Canada too.
Yeah,
Canada
and
too.
Canada, right. So, and this has been said by many other people for years, that UNRWA needs fast reforms, if not complete replacement with a different organization that is going to actually educate for peace. The UNRWA education curriculum takes up 60% of the budget, and it claims to be literally, like I'm quoting literally from the UN, the UNRWA curriculum. It's an education for peace. But if you look at that curriculum, it is the opposite of peace. So, that's the answer here. I mean, it's not only UNRWA's curriculum. There are also, the curriculums in Jordan and Syria are also, very problematic. But I think that can be reformed. I mean, the U.S. and other European powers and Canada as well have leverage over these countries. They can withhold certain aid. They can condition aid upon the reform of these curriculums. So, I mean, that's one answer to your question. But the question about Iran and its role in this conflict, I mean, I don't know how we change that. It's, you and I were talking earlier about how interesting it is that the Israeli and Iranian governments before the revolution, under the Shah, Israel and Iran had wonderful relations. There were flights to Iran from Israel. There was cooperation, diplomatic cooperation. So, I mean, it's not as if this has never.
It's not impossible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not impossible. It's not unprecedented. It,
Definitely not. Yeah, and a lot of analysts also say, I guess it would take for the leadership in a country like the Islamic Republic of Iran and other regions or other countries that you mentioned to change in order for there to be that kind of change, that it can't be that system that it currently is.
yeah. Well, it will take true leadership on behalf of, Western leaders to pressure that regime and to empower more democratic forces, more peace-seeking forces within Iran. And I think if you look back to the Grand Mufti Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who really serves as the kind of model for he set the formula for every Palestinian leader. I mean, the reason he began that incitement campaign and that disinformation campaign and all of the propaganda surrounding Al-Aqsa was because he had faced for years accusations of nepotism, misuse of religious funds, corruption, and those, he
That
didn't
sounds like
face
today.
those. Right. He was extremely corrupt. And yet once he started this propaganda campaign and made it seem to his people as if all of their problems were because of the Zionists and the Jews of Palestine and the Jewish immigrants. By the way, he used very xenophobic language that is eerily similar to the xenophobic language we hear from so many politicians today against Jewish immigrants, bringing, ideals that are, the antithesis of our ideals. He railed against Jewish immigrants, changing the fabric of our society. And, the British, they had appointed this man to his role. They had the power to strip him of that role. They had also created the Supreme Muslim Council, which he was the president of, and that Supreme Muslim Council oversaw all of the religious funds, all of the holy sites. They had the power to and the leverage over him to change and to end this propaganda campaign, to work towards peace.
But they
And
didn't.
they didn't.
No.
And they rewarded him. I mean, he became even more powerful after the riots he incited. And we see that today, how, terrorism is rewarded. There's a reason why Israel had to carry out this extremely painful hostage deal in which innocent people are being returned in exchange for hundreds of murderers. Israel wouldn't have had to do that, had to release murderers from prison if the world had put the kind of pressure it should have placed on Hamas and its benefactors in Qatar and elsewhere. And, if that kind of pressure had been placed on Hamas, if even a fraction of the pressure that had been placed on Israel had been placed on Hamas, I don't think Israel would be releasing terrorists from prison, at least not in the numbers they are.
And if you look at the geopolitics, not just in the region, but around the world, you are seeing the beginnings of the strengthening of Russia through President Donald Trump. And of course, Russia and Iran and China are allies, and that could help strengthen that axis as well. And that would even lead to what you're talking about even further.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying to see how President Trump is aligning with Putin. I mean, I don't think any of us were surprised by his, being much cozier with Putin than the Biden administration was. But I think the level of allyship he's showing for Putin has reached beyond our worst fears. And I think for Israel, it should be especially terrifying since Russia is on the side of Iran, or of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And, it's hard to know what to expect and how that alliance will influence Israel as it tries to weaken the influence of the Islamic regime.
Yeah, and I was just watching an interview with Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff. He was on, I think it was CBS News or one of the American outlets, and he had said that he had a 3-hour conversation in person with Vladimir Putin. And she had asked, was there an intelligence officer? Was there somebody note-taking? And he said it was just the two of them one-on-one. And he had alluded to, a lot of sanctions being lifted from Russia and a lot of American businesses going back into Russia as well.
Yeah, I mean, who knows where this leads, but it is certainly cause for concern.
And going to have a huge impact on the region at large, which leads me to my last question that, Iran and Israel have been having war, if you will, or a conflict, I should say, through their proxies for
Mm.
a number of decades. And now they're on the brink of a direct war, potentially. After all this back and forth tit for tat between the two nations. Now, how has Iran played into the geopolitics of Israel and vice versa, in your view?
So, I mean, I think that where we stand now in February of 2025, it seems that we are in a different place than we were in, say, October of 2024, when it really did feel as if, an all-out war between Iran and Israel was
Going to happen any moment, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Israel deserves a lot of credit for the damage it did to the axis of resistance of Iran, whether it was in Gaza with Hamas, the huge reduction in Hamas's stockpile of weapons, its amount of fighters, and in Lebanon with the complete, destruction. I mean, Hezbollah still exists. It's not gone, but I mean, it's extremely weakened. And, that, of course, set the stage for the toppling of the
Bashar
regime in
al-Assad.
Syria. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that the Iranian axis and Iran's proxies are severely weakened to the point where I don't think Iran is interested or capable of fighting a war with Israel. And I don't think Israel is interested in a war with, I mean, Israel has always been, whatever criticism you have for Israel, it has always been a defensive, it doesn't really launch wars. I mean, all of the wars Israel has fought have been launched by its enemies, and Israel, then responds very forcefully to those attacks and those wars, but it doesn't seek war. And I don't think that Israel is going to bring about a war with Iran unless Iran does something like, move closer to a nuclear weapon, that maybe leads Israel to take a preemptive strike to prevent that. But I don't think that even if it did that, Iran would be foolish enough to then, strike at Israel, because I think Iran, the regime is at a very weak point right now. But again, that goes back to our previous discussion about the influence of the U.S. administration. And, I think there were a lot of hopes for the Trump administration that it would be tougher on Iran. There were a lot of hopes. And I think that right now where things stand and, the signals and the messages we've gotten from Trump administration officials have not really stood up to those expectations. So I don't really know where we go from here in terms of where that kind of proxy war. By the way, Israel doesn't have proxies. When we talk about the proxy war, we're talking about Iran and its proxies, just to clarify. But yeah, so I think a lot will depend on what the Trump administration does in terms of and says in terms of Iran.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Yardena Schwartz, author of Ghosts of a Holy War. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nagar. It was such a great conversation, and I hope to be back again soon.
Ditto. If you like this episode, hit the like button. Leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.